Welcome to Medieval Germanica. I'm your host, Brandon Foster. In today's podcast, we are going to discuss the Indo-European story of Mannus, Manu, which can be found in both Germanic mythology and Hindu mythology. Wait to the end because we're going to talk about the flood story and how these two mythical figures, Mannus and Manu, relate to each other and the Judeo-Christian flood story. So grab your cup of coffee and let's begin. Welcome back. First, I want to talk a little bit about who Mannus is. Mannus was. And then we're going to talk about Manu, who is the counterpart of Mannus. They're actually kind of the same thing, but we'll get there. So, Mannus is a Germanic mythological figure that we first come to contact with in Tacitus's writings called Germania. Now, this is a short book that he wrote kind of discussing the kind of Germanic world. It actually has a much longer name, but I'm not going to go into it. And he talks about lots of different things. He talks about some of their religious culture, their social culture, their warfare, different tribes, lots of different things. And he doesn't even go much into detail about this individual, but all we know is that he is a deity. His name is Mannus. He is the son of Twisto, who is Earth, and he has three sons. Now, other versions that claim to be older claim he has more than three sons, but by the time that Tacitus is writing, he only has three sons, and these three sons are actually the propagators of the Germanic tribes. So we have Ingvaeones, Hirmeaones, and Instvaeones. I'm not sure if I'm ever saying those names right. I just read them, and who knows if I'm saying it right. So from each one, we are given what tribes come from these. So in Ingvaeones, we have the North Sea. So this would be all of the Nordic tribes in the Nordic language. So Denmark and all the other Scandinavians, Norway, Sweden, stuff like that. Then we have the Hirmeaones, and they live near the Elbe River. This would be your Eastern, more Germanic speakers. And then we have the one that I focus on the most, which is the Instvaeones. And this is the one that focus on the Rhine. So the tribes that live near the Rhine or the Weser Rhine Germanic language, which is where we get the Franks. And then also eventually the Saxons, the Angles who become the English, stuff like that. So we know that based off of Indo-European reconstruction, that the name of Mannus means man. So in the Germanic mythological world, the first man slash deity was Mannus. And then he had three sons, and then that would start the human world. And we're not told really much else. So we know that they kind of called him the first holy king. And this leads into other areas like Manu. And Manu we know from the different Hindu writings. The Hindus had a earlier writing system, a more developed writing system, and a writing system that has, lasted to this day. The Germanic tribes had some forms of runic writing. I'm just now getting into the linguistic side of Germanic, so I'm not going to go too much into it because I know practically nothing. But there is some things about some runics, runic stones, runic writing, and so we know they had some form of a writing system, but we don't really have anything. We have very little. It's not until later into the solid medieval world where we get Nordic writing, and that's where we know more about Germanic stories. because the Germans, coming from the Nordic world, their stories are going to be very similar. Some of the names may change, a few details may change, like when we talk about the Hindu stories, we can't exactly say it's a one-to-one comparison, but we can look at those stories and infer a little bit based off what we know about Mannus, that if Manu does something, maybe that story is older and just kind of developed into the more Hindu version when there was also a Germanic version. Again, if there's a Nordic version of a story, we can say that there's also possibly a Germanic version. Like one thing we do know is that Odin was Nordic, Woden was Germanic. So they added a W in front of Odin. So stuff like that, we can kind of infer and reconstruct different things. So I now want to turn to the uh, Hindu version and kind of talk a little bit about that so that we can look in, like I said, compare a little bit about what these two might have had in common, and then maybe the things that we are lacking in the Germanic side, maybe we can restruct a little bit just for sake of trying. So in India, when the Indo-European group migrated to India, because the Germans, and the Indo-Europeans that moved to India are of the same ancestry. They brought with them a story of someone named Manu, Manu, instead of Mannus, Mannus. So very similar. And we know that this is the first man, and he is the author of the Sanskrit law code, and that's called the Manu Smriti, Laws of Manu. And as we just talked about, Manus means man, Manu also means man. So there must have been a root in the Indo-European of Manu, Mannus having something in common. Again, I'm just new to some of this, so I don't know what it is yet. So we know that they both have the same figure, that both mean man. And then we also know that in this Manu Smriti, that the man also means to think. So Manu was a very pondering type of figure. And in this version of the story, we have our first sacrifice. In other versions, Manu also sacrifices a cow, and that is both in the Germanic, and then we also see the importance of cows in the Hindu stories. So cows were very important to Indo-Europeans. It's something that definitely separates them from other groups, is their just kind of focus on cattle, which is something that's very interesting because you don't see that in most other cultures, focusing so heavily on an animal. You might see some animals, like in the Hebrew culture, sheep were important because most Hebrews were shepherds, but this very huge emphasis on the cow is very interesting. So, one thing that's interesting about Manu, and where we can start adding more to Mannus, is that Manu we have more stories about. One of the stories we have is the flood story. So Manu in the Hindu story is actually a combination of the biblical characters Noah and Adam, which is very interesting. And then we can also put that over to Mannus, that he was probably also a Noah Adam character. So in the Hindu stories, we have and I'm going to butcher this, so I apologize, the Shatapatha Brahmana, and this is a recount of how a fish warns Manu about a flood coming to destroy all of humanity. He then builds a boat, and when the flood comes, this boat is tied to the fish's horn, and they are steered to a mountaintop. Now, of course, some of the story is different than the Judeo-Christian account, which talks about God personally warning Noah. Noah then spending like over 100 years building an ark, God shutting the door to seal Noah, his wife, his three sons, and their wives. And then the storm comes, land on a mountain, and they're saved. Now, in this version, the fish is either identified as Brahma or Lord Vishnu, depending on the different versions. So it is also a deity, and it depends on which deity. So again, there's some similarities, but it does change. Now, going back to Mannus, if you remember what I said about his sons, he had three, which I think is very interesting because, again, in the Judeo-Christian story, Noah has three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And as far as I've seen in the Manu story, there aren't three sons. Now, there might be, and I just haven't read about them. I haven't done a significant amount of research into this. And I definitely do not read Sanskrit, so I can't read it myself. But Mannus has three sons, and those three sons then create all the Germanic people, and in their religious sense, all of mankind, which is very interesting because that's also what the Judeo-Christian Bible says, that Noah, his three sons, then repopulate the world and therefore bring mankind again to everybody. So it's a very interesting comparison where we can look at Mannus, who is a Germanic deity, Manu, who is a Hindu deity or character, a mythological character, I guess. And we can look at the two and see how similar they are, and then look at the character Manu in the flood story and compare him to the Judeo-Christian flood story, see the similarities, and then take those over to Mannus and see his three sons. And the story fits in pretty well over there because of his three sons. It connects a piece that we were missing with Manu. So it's a really fascinating little thought exercise. Again, this is all kind of putting pieces together without a ton of evidence. So I can't say this is anything that is groundbreaking, 100% true, but it's interesting. I find mythology very interesting, especially how it can connect different cultures. Because while every culture is unique and special in its own way, we all come from the same area, whether you believe in evolution, where we all come from the same line through evolution, we all come from the same thing, or you believe in a more religious side, like the Christian side, where we all come from Noah or Adam first. So all these things are going to have connections, and that's really cool when we can make those connections because it shows that we are all connected, to use the word way too many times. So, in this episode, you learn about Manu, Mannus, flood stories, and the connection between Germanic cultures and Hindu cultures, which is pretty cool, and a connection to all those with the Bible, which is a Middle Eastern and Mediterranean document, and it is fascinating how all this can connect. Now, this is a short episode and one that's not really terribly deep or long or anything, but it's something I thought would be super interesting to share, something that I've read about, learned about, and wanted to share with you guys. So if you have any questions, if you like it, you know all this stuff. Comment, share it, whatever. You know what to do. Thanks for listening and have a wonderful day.